my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats. And in April, I had such grand reading plans. The Hugo shortlist was announced and I thought I am going to just hit the ground running and read so many of these books, and I ended up not doing that at all. I accidentally reread the Murderbot Diaries instead. So how did this happen, Kelsey? What went wrong? Have you no self-control? Apparently not. I forget exactly when the trailer for the Apple TV show dropped, but that happened, and I immediately thought, oh, I need to reread just All Systems Read, the first book only, before this show drops, so that this will be fresh in my memory for comparison purposes. But these books are like potato chips. You cannot eat just one. So I was halfway through Artificial Condition, reckoning with myself, okay, Kelsey, I know you said you weren't going to read this book, but maybe you will just read the first 4 novellas and then you will stop. And we all know how that went. It was the first 4 novellas and Fugitive Telemetry, and then at that point you might as well just read the novels as well. Not only was this not my Hugo reading, this was the wrong Martha Wells series. I am 1 book away from finishing the books of the Raksura so I can do a series review of those, which is a video I've really been looking forward to making. I just realized the stack I was holding up in the thumbnail, the books were all in the wrong order. So this was the 3rd time I've read the first 4 novellas. It was only the 2nd time I had read Fugitive Telemetry, and the first time that I read it in chronological order, because I first read this when it was released after Network Effect. It was the 3rd time I've read Network Effect because I reread this right when System Collapse came out, but this was only the 2nd time I've read System Collapse. So this is the first time I've read the whole series to date, all the way through consecutively, because when this book came out, I only went back and reread this one. I didn't do a reread of any of the others. But this video isn't going to be a formal series review like I sometimes do on this channel, nor is it really going to be a wrap-up in the sense of going book by book and giving my opinions on each one. This is, I guess, a reflection on my reread experience of this series, why I think they're so rereadable, why they're so bingeable, why I feel like I can't just read one, I need to read them all, and what hit me differently this time as opposed to on previous reads. So I don't know what to tell you about whether this video is worth watching if you haven't read the books yet. This isn't going to be the video where I try to convince you that you need to read these books if you haven't. It probably also won't be super spoilery though, but if you haven't read these books, this video might not be for you. You might be a little lost. I will say I have talked about all of these books on my channel before, except for maybe System Collapse. I might not have talked about System Collapse after the first time I read it. One of the things about rereads for me, and I enjoy rereading books so much and I do it so infrequently, is that I am almost always subconsciously looking for things I might not have noticed on previous reads. And I think for any really good, enjoyable reread, yes, I'll be looking forward to all my favorite scenes that I remember, but I'll also be looking for new favorite moments. So a little bit of my history with these books. I was initially very reluctantly sold on All Systems Read back when it was released, and I was convinced to read this by all of the very strong recommendations from friends and people in the online book community. On my own, I don't think I would have ever picked up a book that looked like this and had this title. And I didn't initially purchase any of the first 4 novellas. I acquired this copy of All Systems Read much later, and I actually had a NetGalley e-arc of Artificial Condition, so that's the only one of these books that I have a formal review of on Goodreads and on this channel. I think I paired it in a double review with another Tor.com novella. And I revisited that review and I stand by everything I said, but it's not a very personal review. It's a very, here is what the book is and why I think you might like it type of review. I must have gotten Rogue Protocol from the library as well when it was released, and then I had this print arc of Exit Strategy from Book Expo. And then it was only after Exit Strategy was a 5-star read for me, the others had all been 4 stars, that I committed to purchasing the rest of the books as they were released. I do have both Artificial Condition and Rogue Protocol on ebook, and those are what I have read on Reread, as well as a finished ebook of Exit Strategy, so I don't reread the arcs, even though I still technically have the e-arc of Artificial Condition on my e-reader, and I have this one as a shelf trophy. But I am looking out for like secondhand copies of those middle 2 books, and it frustrates me to no end that now there are bind-ups, and the copies that I'm finding in stores are the bind-ups, and they paired the first 2 and the second 2, but I need 2 and 3. In case you are not aware, books 1 through 4 of this series are all novellas, and they are a story arc. Fugitive Telemetry was published later, but if you're reading them in chronological order, it comes next. It's also a novella, and it's a bit of a side story. And then Network Effect and System Collapse are the 2 novels, and they are a story arc as well. And at no point in any of my rereads of these books have I felt compelled to change my initial ratings of them. My initial ratings are 4 stars for All Systems Read, Artificial Condition, and Rogue Protocol, 5 stars for Exit Strategy, 4 for Fugitive Telemetry, 5 for Network Effect, and 4 for System Collapse. And now for the hard part of this video. What did I actually feel about these books this time around? And despite my ratings staying the same, what did jump out at me differently? There's a sense in which the first 4 novellas, and I would include Fugitive Telemetry in that too, so the first 5 novellas, feel episodic. Each of them has Murderbot, the protagonist, who is a cyborg construct with both human and artificial parts, put in high-stakes situations with new groups of humans. And in each of them, Murderbot ends up behaving really rather heroically. And one of the big through lines of the first 4 books, and really the series as a whole, is Murderbot really just figuring out what it wants. And each book's storyline helps put together a different piece of that picture. When we first meet Murderbot, it seems content to just keep doing its job, even though it's hacked its governor module, for an absolutely terrible, shitty, unnamed Bond company. Because mostly it can just stand around and watch its favorite media. And Murderbot's experience with the media it watches and how that colors its experience of the real circumstances it encounters was one of the most accessible through lines in these books for me when I first read them. I feel like that's a really accessible thematic entryway into these books for science fiction nerds. It's a little bit pandering to the fan base, but only a little bit, because there is some very clever media commentary going on. In this read, though, I think I was paying more attention to Murderbot's relationships with all the people. There are obviously the preservation humans we meet in book 1 who become recurring characters throughout the series, and there's Art, aka Perihelion, who we meet in the 2nd book and who returns in the novels. And I will admit that I had a realization this time through that I think the reason that Exit Strategy and Network Effect are my 5-star favorite books in these series is because I am a sucker for a dramatic reunion between characters, and that's what happens in each of these books. But Artificial Condition and Rogue Protocol both have sets of characters who are, at this point, unless we get future books, which I would love, they are one-off characters who don't come back in later books at all. So I haven't necessarily latched on to these characters as much on previous reads of the series. One of the things I like so much about this series that makes it so consumable, such a popcorn reading experience, is the competence porn of it all. I don't know if that's the terminology anyone is still using these days. I feel like it's been a while since I heard that term bandied about on the internet, but like, whatever you call it, where the protagonist is just so good at their job, and you just want to keep reading about this person being so smart and so clever and so competent. I remember during one of my previous reads of this series, seeing one of those things go around on social media, like, you've been kidnapped and the protagonist of the last book you read is coming to your rescue. Are you surviving? And I was obviously like, yes, Murderbot is coming to rescue me. I'm gonna be fine. And another thing this series does so well in almost every book is give us a dramatic rescue of some sort. I love it. And Murderbot is genuinely so good at its job. At least the keeping people safe part of its job, keeping them from getting killed. Not necessarily the constant data mining, invasion of privacy part of its job, which it has started to neglect to a certain extent by the time the first book even starts. But the keeping people safe part of its job is what it chooses to keep doing after the first book, when it can start choosing what it does. And that's what tells us that Murderbot is a good person. Because while Murderbot has a whole ton of like superhuman abilities that allow it to do this job really well, I think it becomes obvious throughout the series that also the reason that Murderbot can do this job very well is because it cares, and this is especially evident in System Collapse, where the humans are saved by something that isn't high-stakes action. But I think because I am so taken with the competence porn of it all, on previous reads, I think I haven't paid as much attention to the parts of these books where Murderbot does make mistakes, lapses in judgment that have consequences, and it does learn from those too, and I do think that is another important through line that I maybe haven't paid as much attention to in the past. And I especially noticed this with these one-off sets of characters. In Artificial Condition, Murderbot is pretending to be a human security consultant for the first time, and it takes a job as a security consultant for this group of young scientists who have been screwed over and need to go to the same place that Murderbot wants to go. And it takes this job because it wants that permit to go to this place. And from the start, it knows that these humans should not be doing this thing, that what they are proposing to do is going to be way more dangerous than any of them understand. And by the end, it finally has the realization that, like, as a person with autonomy and free will, it would have had the authority to tell these people no, and thereby actually keep them safe. And it didn't do that because it wanted that permit, and it's not used to being able to say no to humans. I think on previous reads, I've just been so defensive of Murderbot because when you're reading these books, you identify with it. I'm like, no, you're doing great. But Artificial Condition feels to me like it's kind of a book in two parts. There's the early part, which mostly like watching media with and arguing with Art, the Astral Research Transport, and then there's the whole plot where the action happens in the second half. And those early portions of the book were the portions that I really loved the first couple times I read it, and then I kind of forget the rest of the book. And so that was where I was noticing things that I hadn't been paying attention to the first couple times I read it. And then with Rogue Protocol, I think this is still my least favorite of the first four novellas, and honestly that might just be because there's no one in this aside from Murderbot who's a recurring character. This is also the book in the series where I have the hardest time visualizing what's going on with some of the action, so that slows me down a bit reading it. But spoiler territory, there is a character in this who at the end does die on Murderbot's watch, and that is something that is referred back to later in the series. It's clear that Murderbot has a lot of feelings about this, that it hits hard for Murderbot. And that character death has never particularly hit hard for me because I've never found myself particularly attached to this character. But on this read, I think I just was paying more attention to this group of characters and the reasons why that character death hits Murderbot hard. We also briefly at the beginning of this book get a group of characters who never show up again in the series but are also referred to again later in the series because meeting them ended up having a long-term impression on Murderbot where they are essentially totally doomed and Murderbot doesn't even try to do anything to save them. It's too late. They have basically already signed their lives away to indentured servitude, which leads to the whole corporate dystopia of this series, which I will talk about more a little later. So Rogue Protocol is maybe a slightly more melancholy book in the series, a little bit more of a downer, but in a way that I think I have maybe appreciated a little more on this read than I have in the past. And then at the beginning of Exit Strategy is when Murderbot realizes that everything it did in Rogue Protocol created a dramatically more dangerous situation for the preservation humans that it left behind at the end of book one. Then we get a dramatic rescue. My favorite. I feel kind of uncomplicated joy about Exit Strategy for all the same reasons I did the first two times I read it. There's nothing really new for me to say here. Moving on to Fugitive Telemetry, which I did read in chronological order this time. This takes place on Preservation Station, so this is the first and possibly only book in the series that doesn't take place even in part in the Corporation Rim, which is the dystopia situation. And so it starts out as a much lower stakes story. It's a pretty straightforward murder mystery until near the end when suddenly there is a dramatic rescue that needs to happen. Thank goodness, because if there wasn't a dramatic rescue happening, in a Murderbot book, I would feel let down. I don't actually feel like I have a ton more to say about this though, so I'm just gonna move on. The novels are a big novel and a short novel. Network Effect is the big novel. System Collapse is the short novel. Not only is Network Effect considerably more pages, but it's also a slightly larger sized hardcover and has more text per page. I still think Network Effect is the best book in the series, but I don't know that I personally got a whole ton that was different out of this book on my third read of it than I did on my first two reads. We have at least 2 really dramatic rescues in this book, depending on how you count, probably more than 2. But the big ones are at the beginning, when Murderbot really dramatically rescues important recurring character, and then at the end, when the tables turn and Murderbot gets dramatically rescued, which is like big emotional feelings. But when I first read this, when it was released, I felt like it was a huge shift in how the series was tackling the aforementioned corporate dystopia, which is absolutely the backdrop and the landscape of the first 4 books. But in this book, we meet a group of people who are part of an actual resistance movement, as opposed to just living outside of it and somewhat sheltered and removed from it, like everyone on preservation. Actually, in retrospect, I feel like maybe that stood out less as a dramatic shift in the series for me, because there is a little bit of that in Fugitive Telemetry as well, and this time I read these in chronological order. But I also think it was less dramatic to me this time around because I think I was reading the first 4 novellas this time with a more active eye for those dystopian elements. One of the main themes of these books from the start is the exploitation of labor and how degrading that is. The use of constructs that are clearly people but not treated as such, being only one of the most extreme examples of that in the Corporation Rim. And what this resistance group is doing in these 2 books is finding these groups of vulnerable people and giving them the option of self-determination, of autonomy, and of choices over their own life, which is what Murderbot is figuring out for itself from the very beginning of the series. So on this read through, this all felt much more of a piece to me in some ways than it did when I was reading the series in chunks. This series also has consistently a lot of running commentary about just basic run-of-the-mill, very relatable to our current reality, like unethical business practices and unethical uses of technology that are just so pervasive that you can't opt out of them even if you want to, like the aforementioned surveillance and data mining. And that, I think, is just one of those examples about how really good science fiction is always commentary on the present. And I think it's one of the reasons that these books are books that I find worth coming back to. I've said before that the worse the world is out here, like the weirder and harder it is for me to find something that I actually feel like reading. Like, I'm surrounded by books I should be reading. And I ended up rereading Murderbot because nothing else would do. And I think one of the reasons these books work so well for me, and I think work so well for a lot of other people too, even when it's become harder and harder to read a lot of other books for various reasons, is the fact that they are character-driven, escapist fun without ignoring the harsh realities of the world we live in. And yes, with a good deal of humor, while at the same time being something very close to an actual dystopian series that is deeply, deeply informed by some of the things that are wrong with the world we live in today. And so reading this type of book is enjoyable without feeling like you're like stuffing earplugs in your ears and going la 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 la, the bad stuff isn't happening. I don't know, does that make sense to anyone else? That's kind of how I feel. It's why I like things that are purely cozy sometimes just hit so wrong when what I need is a comfort read. Does that make sense? But at the end of Network Effect, it feels like we're at the end of this story arc with the stuff that's happening on this planet. And then system collapse happens. And I still have some complicated feelings about system collapse. There are things in this book that I love, but also things about it that just frustrate me a little. I think the first time I read it, I was really just frustrated that we were still on this planet because Murderbot does not want to be on this planet, so I didn't want to be on this planet either. But in this book, our cast of characters learn that there is a whole nother group of humans on this contaminated planet that they have to contact after all the events of book one, and so they set out to do that. And Murderbot gets roped into this mostly by accident, even though everyone promised it wouldn't have to go back to the planet. And I think the first time I read this, I was just like so aggrieved on Murderbot's behalf that it had to go on this adventure, that it couldn't opt out and say, no, I'm not doing this one. I'm staying behind. Because in this book, Murderbot is not doing great following the events of the prior book. But this time around, I was a little more resigned to what this book actually is, and I had, I think, a slightly better time with it. Murderbot is having like totally normal human mental health PTSD issues, and it's kind of having a hard time being hyper competent. It isn't as on the ball as it normally is, and it isn't trusting its own judgment as much as it normally does. But then, as I mentioned, it turns out that what's needed here isn't Murderbot's like action hero skills, but something more empathetic. We do still get plenty of action though, and here's the thing, I still don't love the like action plot parts of this book as much as some of the other books. I feel like it just takes a little too long getting from point A to point B in a number of places. Like, we just spend too much page time worrying about how we're going to get through this tunnel in the ground or whatever, and not quite enough on the things that like actually matter to me reading this book. There's a mix of returning favorite characters and newer characters here. One of the newer characters in particular is very interesting, but we didn't learn as much about him as I kind of would have liked to. I would have liked to dig a little deeper into that character in this book. And overall, I think this is fine as like an addendum to the end of Network Effect. Again, there are things I really like about it. It maybe could have been slimmed down to a novella, and it would have been fine. I am not, however, happy with this as the end of the series if we don't end up getting more books. Don't get me wrong, it's not like a cliffhanger ending where, you know, there's clearly something that needs to be wrapped up that isn't. This is the conclusion of a story arc, but both of these two books seem to be teasing a potential new story arc that we haven't gotten any word about yet, and Martha Wells has gone on to publish Witch King since this, and now we're getting a sequel to Witch King, which I am also not mad about because I loved Witch King and I'm glad it's getting a sequel, but I would also be thrilled with more Murderbot. Which brings me to the upcoming TV show. I suppose I am thrilled that we are getting more Murderbot, even if it's coming in the form of an adaptation as opposed to an 8th book. I have so little experience with things that I actually like getting adaptations. I feel like it maybe hasn't happened since I was a kid and they turned Ella Enchanted into a movie, and it totally ruined it in my small childhood opinion. From the trailer and what we've seen so far, it does look like they're getting some things about the tone and the characters right, so I live in hope. My one like nitpicky thing that I really hope they stick with from the books is I hope they don't name the company. I feel like I would be upset learning the name of the company in an adaptation before it's been revealed in the books. In the books, it isn't like explicitly made clear that the reason the company doesn't have a name is because Murderbot is censoring it out from its own record of events, which the books are Murderbot's telling of events from its own logs, and it censors the name of the company out of its own logs. That isn't directly addressed until fairly late in the series, and I would love if instead of deciding they had to name the company, they decided to like censor it out in a way that it was obvious that Murderbot was bleeping it for us. That would be ideal for me. I'm clearly very excited to see the rise and fall of Sanctuary Moon, the show within the story that Murderbot has been hyping me up for years, and I feel like I know both everything and nothing about it. And I hope that if they make season 2 that we also get to see world hoppers and that it's dramatically different from Sanctuary Moon in some way, because what we saw from the trailer, Sanctuary Moon kind of visually looks like what I imagine world hoppers looking like. They're not the same show. And I do hope that they get to showcase some of the corporate dystopia of it in a way that highlights the relevance of this story right now. I think that's part of what makes these books so worth reading. Anyways, if you've stuck around this long, thank you so much. If you want to leave a comment, let's chat about these books. As I said, I wasn't really starting out this video with the intent of like convincing anyone who hasn't read these books to start doing so now. I think there are plenty of other videos from other creators and reviews all over the internet that can help you figure out if you want to do that. But if you've read these books, especially if you've read them multiple times like I have, feel free to drop a comment. Anyhow, I hope you're having a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.